Where is the line between external tolerance and the internal compromise of your convictions? This is a line that we need to figure out because authoritarians seldom are satisfied with just outward compliance. Recently in the sports world, there have been a couple of examples of athletes who, as matters of faith, have made decisions to not participate in things that their team is promoting. For example, recently during Pride Month, 5 players on the Tampa Bay Rays Major League Baseball team declined to wear uniforms that celebrated Pride Month with symbols of the rainbow that they had placed on their uniforms for Pride Night at the ballpark. The criticism of those players has been fierce and dramatic, with the argument basically being, what's the harm? It's just a uniform. It's no big deal. Well, in the world of soccer, recently, in the Paris Saint-Germain Soccer League in France, there's a Senegalese player whose name is Dreher. He also refused to wear the rainbow colors on the field in support of the LGBTQ plus movement, and his team allowed him to sit out the game. He has also received incredible criticism because they wanted him to just wear the uniform for a team portrait, and again he refused. And they say, what's the big deal? It's just a harmless gesture. Well, here's the thing. We've got to figure out as Christians how to live between 2 places in the Bible. One of those places is in Jeremiah chapter 29. Jeremiah 29 was written from God through the prophet Jeremiah to the people of Israel who were being carried off into exile in Babylon. For a time, they were being taken away from their homeland. They were living within a pagan culture that was hostile to what they valued. And this is the advice that the prophet gives them that came from God. Jeremiah 29 verse 4 says this, "This is what the Lord of armies, the God of Israel, says to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them. Plant gardens and eat their produce. Take wives and father sons and daughters, and take wives for your sons and give your daughters to husbands, so that they may give birth to sons and daughters and grow in numbers there and do not decrease. Seek the prosperity of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord in its behalf, for in its prosperity will be your prosperity." It's interesting, the advice that was given to the people of God was, even though you're in a pagan culture, pray for that nation, pray for the city in which you live. In other words, as Christians, we are to be engaged in the culture. We are to share as much as possible in moving the culture in positive directions. In other words, to be productive citizens. And yet, there are times where we realize that there's a line of decision in front of us where the culture is not allowing us to just participate up to the place that we can, by good conscience, participate, but then it begins to demand that we comply with things that are against our conscience. Some of the recent legislation in America that is being proposed in Congress would put doctors and other medical professionals at risks of not having any conscience opt-out for participating in, for example, transgender transition surgeries. What we're doing is we're saying the ideology of the elite ruling class now trumps, pardon the pun, it trumps our individual consciences and the traditional protections that the American experiment has built in for those conscientious objections. Well, in the book of Daniel, we find the opposite extreme. Jeremiah says, do as best you can to live and participate in the culture, pray for the prosperity of the culture. And yet, Daniel, another prophet, writing to the same group of people, operating out of the halls of power. I mean, you can't get much more engaged in the culture than the fact that Daniel and some of his friends, as they were carried into exile from the land of Judah, they are taken into the king's service. You can't get much more participatory in the culture than to be in the king's service. And yet there was a time when the king set up a statue and said, I want all of my subjects to bow down and worship this statue that I've established. I am your God. And there were 3 of Daniel's friends who refused to do it. They wouldn't bow down because that crossed the line of their conscience. And what's interesting is in Daniel 3, we have this interesting conversation where the king comes and in a very magnanimous gesture, he talks to these young men and gives them, in effect, a second chance. Listen to what he says. Daniel chapter 3, verse 14. Nebuchadnezzar began speaking and said to them, Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods, nor worship the golden statue that I have set up? Is this report that I'm getting accurate? You haven't bowed down to worship the gods of this world that I've established? Verse 15. Here's where the second chance comes in. In his mind, the king is being eminently reasonable. Bowing down, it's just a simple gesture. It doesn't really matter. Just do it. You'll avoid a lot of hassle. You'll avoid a lot of trouble. You won't get canceled if you just do this. It's a simple thing. Verse 15, he says, Now if you're ready, at the moment you hear the sound of the horn, flute, lyre, trigon, psaltery, and bagpipe, and all kinds of musical instruments, if you're ready to fall down and worship the statue that I have made, very well. I'm going to give you another chance. We're going to reenact this moment, and you get to have another chance. But if you do not worship, you will immediately be thrown into the midst of a furnace of blazing fire, and what God is there who can rescue you from my hands? Now that's a fascinating question. I'm going to give you another chance to submit to my rule, to declare your loyalty to me as your God above all other gods. But if you don't, I'm going to toss you in a fiery furnace, and there's not a God out there that can protect you in that situation. See, that's the message. What we have to understand, we'll talk about how that story ends in just a minute, but that's where we live in 21st century America. We are placed here sovereignly by God. We need to live our lives here, buy our houses, raise our families, and as much as we can, we need to promote our culture. We need to participate in our culture. But we also need to understand at some point there's a line which if we cross, we have moved from general participation in the culture, we've moved to a statement of a new loyalty that now compromises our deepest held convictions and faith. We need to know how to think about that because that line is rapidly approaching for many of us. There is a book that I don't recommend books on this format very often, but here's a book you need to read. It's one of the most important books I've read in the last 2 years. It's by a man named Dreher, and it's called Live Not by Lies. He talks about, the subtitle is A Manual for Christian Dissidents. He talks about how we live in a culture that is hostile to what we believe. Because going all the way back to George Orwell, when he wrote the book 1984, Orwell understood that certain acts are culturally symbolic. For example, wearing pride logos on a team uniform. Mimicking what the culture requires is only the beginning. It's never enough to say, okay, it's just a patch, it's just on the sleeve of my uniform, I can do this. Mimicking that is only the beginning because once we cross that line, Orwell tells us that that the authoritarian elite are never satisfied with that. There's a scene in the book 1984 where a member of the state by the name of O'Brien is grilling the protagonist in the book, by a man by the name of John Smith. Smith has unruly thoughts. He's not sufficiently in agreement with the state. And O'Brien tells him at one point, he says, you need to recite 2 + 2 = 5. But 2 + 2 doesn't equal 5. Yes, he said, 2 + 2 = 5 if the state says it does. And so Smith says 2 + 2 = 5. And O'Brien says that's not good enough. You have to recite 2 + 2 = 5 until you not only believe that it's true, but that you love the truth of it. Folks, the line for us is we're going to be asked to do things in our culture. And the initial presentation is going to be, listen, it's not a big deal. Just go along to get along. We have to know where that line is, because once that line is crossed, they're going to say, okay, now repeat that. And don't just do it on the outside. Repeat it until you really believe it, and repeat it until you believe it so much that you love it. Dreher's book, Live Not by Lies, gives us some ideas about how Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came to this conclusion. You see, for them, they knew Jeremiah's instruction to participate in the culture, to pray for its prosperity, to live as best you could. But when the culture demanded that they worship another god, they said, yeah, we can't go there. We can't get to that place. But I want you to notice what the king said. He said, if you don't do this, I'm going to throw you in a fiery furnace. And then he issues a challenge, in effect, when he says, and what God is there who can rescue you from my hands? One of the things that, as followers of Jesus, that we're going to have to get right in our minds is that when we lose things in this culture because we're Christians, when we finally get to the place that we lose social standing, that we lose certain privileges that the culture provides, when we lose the ability to shop in this store or go to that place, when we lose certain benefits of citizenship, when those are taken away because we will not comply, we need to understand the question may be that God is waiting to show himself mighty on behalf of somebody who will take a stand on the basis of truth. You see, we know the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The music started, everybody bowed down except those 3 young men. There's nothing more awkward than being left standing while everybody else has their face in the dirt. Well, the king in his fury commanded that they be carried off and thrown into a fiery furnace, and that the furnace was to be heated up 7 times hotter than normal. He threw them in, and then he asked an interesting question. Didn't we throw 3 men into the fire? Because I can see 4 men walking around. They finally brought those boys out of the fire. They were not only untouched, but their clothes weren't even singed. The only thing that burned were probably the ropes binding their hands. See, when they got into the heart of the fire, there was a 4th person. There was Jesus. And he was right there beside them the whole time. And the king said, nobody has a God like the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Listen, if we go along to get along in this culture, it won't be enough to just do this or do that. They will eventually press us until we love the truth that they've forced us to believe. It's time to make up your mind in advance. Those boys said, God can save us if you throw us in this fire, but even if he doesn't, we still won't compromise our convictions. This is one of the great faith moments in the entire Bible. Even if he doesn't. Folks, when the government decides that we are no longer to be tolerated, we can either give in, we can go along to get along, knowing that to compromise our faith, our convictions about truth, is to really put ourselves on the opposite side of God. Or we can take a stand and we can say, listen, God can save us in the middle of this stand, but even if he doesn't, He's still God. Well, in this case, Jesus was right there with those boys in the fire, the same place he's going to be with us. And the end of the story is the king turned to the true God because they stood firm on truth in the midst of the challenges of their culture. Folks, as believers, as followers of Jesus, we live between Jeremiah 29 and Daniel chapter 3. Participate in the culture, pray for our nation, engage in the pursuit of things that make this country better. But understand that when we reach that line to cross over into the realm of compromise, it will never be enough. The world will demand more and more. Well, it's just a symbolic gesture. Well, that's where it starts. But then the symbolic gesture has to be repeated. Then it has to be believed. Then it has to be loved. And if we can't go there, we have to be willing to say, my God can save me from your persecution. But even if he doesn't, he's still God. And this is still true. And I'm going to stand on truth all the way to the end, knowing that even when the fire comes, Jesus is walking right there beside us. Live not by lies. It's a great title for a great book. We must be a people who live and breathe and stand on the truth of God's Word, come what may. This is Truth Currents.